an original.
From Story Studio Network.
You know, 4 or 5 days we go from complaining about how unseasonably cool it is, and now we're bitching about the heat and humidity. You can't win, right? Beautiful day here in this part of the world. It is Tuesday, May the 30th, and it is just heading into the 9 o'clock hour a.m., and it's just lovely. So, got some studio time set aside for a couple of things. But I think I might go and use the, air quotes, green screen in the garden today as my office space. Kind of nice to do that. So, if you get a chance to get outside and enjoy it. Hot week, yeah. Good for the garden, though. Ours is just crazy. So for all the slow spring that we had, I think those of you who are gardening and investing in your gardens probably got a really good ROI on the cooler, damper temperatures. No, it's just starting to come to life. Holy cow. And I'm no gardener. I just able to sit there and enjoy the view. Welcome in, Dave Trafford here. It is Now and Next for Story Studio Network. I want to talk about a couple of the headlines of the day, go a little bit deeper on some of them. Actually, we like to go deeper on all of them. But just a bit of business first. Tomorrow, if you're still interested, we're having our webinar session at Story Studio Network. And it's a free gathering, so if you want to jump in and find out... The second question we always get from people who are doing their own podcast first is, how much time will it take? And will I have something to say? That's one. And then after that is, how do I grow my audience? So Erin has done all of the magic. She's pretty good at it. So here we are. How do you grow your show? You want to join that? Zip over to the website, storystudionetwork.com. And I'm sure that there's still room for you to jump into the virtual gathering. And it's free. It was interesting. I heard Terry O'Reilly's show on the weekend, Under the Influence. And he talks all about the benefits of doing things for free. Anyway, you can benefit from Aaron's considered wisdom on how to do that kind of stuff. That's tomorrow. I think it's, I want to say noon hour Eastern time. Pretty sure. So that's one thing. And the second thing is, you'll also find a job posting up there. So we're looking for folks to help because we're growing, and we're looking for people who have business development brains. So by all means, zip on over to storystudionetwork.com, and you can jump in, get some considered advice. If not, take the opportunity to let us know why you should be on the team, because it's a growing team. Nice to be able to say that these days. Okay, so here we go. There were 3 elimination games last night, and I watched the Stars take it. I mean, they just came out with nothing, and the Vegas Golden Knights are going on to the Stanley Cup final. It's not finals, by the way. It's the final against the Panthers of Florida, and Florida's going to host the NBA Finals because Miami hung on and beat the Celtics in 7 games, so it'll be Miami and the Nuggets. And then watch to see what was going to happen in Alberta. It was election day yesterday, and all kinds of drama around it, not the least of which just focused on Danielle Smith, the premier of that province, for a whole bunch of reasons. And that had very little to do with politics in some cases. It had more to do with some of the outrageous and just wiggy stuff that she was prescribing to. And by all indications, early on, there was Rachel Notley, the former premier and now leader of the opposition and the NDP. She was measuring the premier's office for curtains because it seemed highly likely that the NDP was going to walk right back into office. So there was some drama about that. But the United Conservative Party, with Danielle Smith at the helm, back in as with a majority government, albeit a smaller one. So I was interested on the weekend. I listened to David Coletto's podcast and also read his reporting on what he was expecting, and it was pretty close in terms of the tea leaves that he presented. David is the he's the founder and the CEO at Abacus Data. Joins us this morning. How are you?
I'm well, Dave. How you doing?
I'm okay. And so I was puttering around listening to your podcast, and I must say that the cello playing that you do off the top of your show is remarkable. I didn't realize you were that gifted.
I've got some gifts that not everybody knows. Yeah.
Right. So the analysis, and people will look at this and say, oh, David was off by 2.5 points or whatever it was in the popular vote. And that's always, to me, a kind of a silly argument, because you will, and I've all the guys I know who are doing that kind of research, and you and Nick Nanos and John Wright, and everybody will say, hey, hang on. The polls, first of all, are a sample of what happened when we took the poll. So that if the election were held that day, chances are pretty good that's would have been the number. And then you take the margin of error into account. It always sounds like you guys are making excuses, and you must get fed up with that.
Yeah, and I mean, to give credit to some of my colleagues, there were some really good, accurate numbers out. We were off by 3 or 4 points. Still had the UCP slightly ahead, but this was not a failure of the polls by any means. And I think everybody expected this outcome based on the numbers we were seeing, which was a UCP majority government. But when you dig down and you actually look at it, so if you look at the results last night, the UCP won just under 53% of the vote. The NDP got 44%. They won by about a million, and 1.7 votes were cast, and the UCP won province-wide by about 150,000 votes. Right, so that's not a close election. But when you dig down and you look at some of the ridings, some of the analysis I've been seeing the morning after suggests that 6 to 8 ridings that would have decided this election one way or the other were decided by 1,500 votes. So had those shifted, right, had collectively those 1,500 votes moved out of 1.7 million, the NDP would have formed a majority government, even though they would have lost the popular vote by 8 points. Right, so that's just how unique Alberta is, how divided the vote is by region, by the 3 kind of key parts, Calgary, Edmonton, and then the rest of the province, and how inefficient, in a way, the UCP vote was, despite it ultimately winning, a convincing victory in terms of overall votes, but not a huge majority for Danielle Smith and the UCP.
Yeah, I mean, they lost a significant number of seats, if you want to look at it that way, too. I mean, were they at 60 seats, something like that? So,
they lost 11.
Yeah, so in the grand scheme of things, that's, the NDP can wave a flag and say we made inroads, and, we're in good shape. But early, I want to say, shortly after Danielle Smith was selected as the leader of the UCP, there was real concern, I think, among the conservative movement out there that, oh, what have we done? Because the backlash to her her record as a broadcaster, some of the things that she had aligned herself with the Freedom Convoy, anti-vaxxers, and some of it, politically irrational, let me put it that way. There was all indication, and I know your numbers showed it, maybe was it December, that looked like the NDP were just going to walk right back into government.
Yeah, I mean, the first impression people had when Danielle Smith took over was not a good one, right? You had a lot of past conservative voters saying, I don't feel good about Danielle Smith. I don't like the direction she's taking the province. I'm worried about, as you said, her past views and what felt like even in Alberta, outside the mainstream, right? An aggressive posture towards the federal government, a willingness just to break things for the sake of breaking them, right? I think that's how people felt. And that was the case for much of the period leading up to the election. And even in the first few weeks of the election, you heard, clips of her come out that saying, yeah, really nutty things. I think most people would agree. However, I think when the leaders debate happened, and in the weeks after that debate, the focus shifted, and I think you saw Danielle Smith run a strong campaign at the end, and this ultimately became a choice for Albertans between two certainly imperfect and questionable choices. Right? This was, I think, a choice around who is the riskier option. For many Albertans, they have never voted NDP. This is a province that, prior to Rachel Notley winning in 2015, had voted almost 50 years for the Progressive Conservative Party, right? A one-party, basically, state. I lived in Alberta for 4 years. I did grad school there, and when you interacted with government, when I was involved in student politics, you just assumed that the PCs were going to win. So there was no point engaging with the opposition because it just, that's the nature of politics. And that's changed to some extent, but there's still a deep seated partisanship. And I don't necessarily think Albertans are overly conservative. They're more conservative, I would say, than other parts of the country, but it's more partisanship. They see their identity attached to big C conservative politics. And so the NDP had to convince a whole bunch of people to vote for them for the first time in their lives. And they made some progress, but I think you'll look at these results and say, as much as people thought Danielle Smith was going to blow this thing, she only got 2% points less than Jason Kenney in 4 years ago. And so on the surface, this is not a loss at all. I don't think you can spin this as a loss. Even though they lost seats, Danielle Smith, I think, will feel she's got a mandate to move forward.
So with that in mind, where was the turning point there? What was it, that debate? I mean, presumably there had to have been something that kind of shifted track there for the leader or the party at some point. Or maybe it was just the debate itself, or again, last time we talked about it, can't forget that the wildfires in Alberta changed the narrative, right, during a campaign.
I think it was a mix of all of those. I think again, there were this group of what I called reluctant UCPers, people who had voted UCP in 2019 and were telling me in our surveys that they were either undecided or they were going to vote for another party. They represented about 1 in 5 Albertans were in that camp. By the end of the campaign, that group had shrunk to just 10%. They shrunk in half, meaning the UCP campaign was able to convince them to come back, to not defect to the NDP or to perhaps not stay home. Now, turnout went actually down, despite how close this election seemed. Voter turnout was down from 2019. So there may have been some of those more progressive conservatives uncomfortable with either choice, just decided to not participate. But I do think that the conservative, the United Conservative campaign, Danielle Smith, was effective not only in controlling her narrative in those final few weeks, but making the NDP actually look riskier. And so ultimately, I think Albertans defaulted more to where they naturally are, and that is, a big C conservative province that will take more time before a majority of the province feels comfortable voting for anything but that conservative option.
I want to get to how this reflects or plays out or is being observed federally in a second, but you just said something in terms of the voter turnout that I find interesting. And we often hear that narrative, well, the voter turnout was down, and it's very likely that this segment of people sat it out. They sat on the sidelines. This might sound like a silly question because I'm almost asking you to prove a negative, but is there a way of knowing who those people are? Is there a really measured way, given the kind of research that you do, that you could almost reverse engineer and say, yeah, well, you know what, there were a lot of NDP leaning folks or progressive conservatives who just said, no, I'm not going to go to the ballot box?
Not easily, because people who don't vote often don't participate in polls as much as those who do, and we know that. People also often over-report their likelihood or whether they actually voted or not in the first place. So we've seen that across academic research and in the polling that I do. But there was evidence in this campaign, again, when you looked at people who were solidly NDP, or solidly UCP, they were motivated to vote. There was a clear choice. They didn't like the other side. They couldn't imagine the other side winning, and that motivated them out yesterday and in the advance poll. But there was that subgroup, that group I talked about, that reluctant group, who, when we asked them, how likely are you to vote, they were substantially less likely to say, I'm actually going to come out and vote. And that's because they looked at both choices and said, I don't love either of these. I don't really hate either of these enough to motivate me to stop them. But, if it's like, again, if you go to a restaurant and you walk by a restaurant and you see the menu and nothing on there, appetizes you're going to just keep walking and find another one. And that's, I think, what a lot of people did. So there's evidence that we know, for example, other demographics like age, the younger people are less likely to vote. That was, I think, a problem for the NDP. That's why the UCP, I think, had this advantage throughout the election, is that they were much stronger among older voters. And then, as much as Danielle Smith, and some of the things she said were controversial and may have repelled people, they also had the effect of mobilizing a big part of her base. They got them excited because there was somebody saying things that they've never heard before. And, you only need to look south of the border to find another candidate who said ridiculous things to most people, but still became president of the United States, and that's Donald Trump.
When we look forward then, and, some among the things that Danielle Smith has talked about is her own version of an independent or a sovereign state in Alberta. And, we can get into the details if we need to, but the point being that Alberta will stand on its own in many respects versus, and I use that phrase deliberately, the federal government versus Justin Trudeau specifically. How does that dynamic play at the federal level? Because I can see the federal Conservatives looking at this playbook. There may have been similar criticisms of Poilievre because, he's kind of come out of the gate and he's turned a lot of people off and he's only been chosen by the core and, all of that, the base and so on. But there are lessons here for them, aren't there?
I think, but I think the lesson they're going to likely take is, I don't think we have to worry about being too controversial or being seen too far out the mainstream, because if we can motivate our base, if we can raise doubts about the other side, we can win. So, I think if Danielle Smith had lost yesterday, I think the lesson would have been, you've got to be careful. And if you go too far away from where people are comfortable, then they're not going to follow you. Whereas at the federal level, when we ask Canadians, do you want to change in government? 74% say they don't want to change in government. That's been the case in the last two elections, frankly. But I think what's happened and the risk for the Conservatives has always been, do enough Canadians feel they're an acceptable alternative? So you could want change, but you still need to feel that there's something worthy of changing too. So I think the lesson for Poilievre is going to be, I'm not going to change my strategy at all. I think I can still win this being who I am and what I stand for. I think the dynamics in terms of the federal provincial landscape will be interesting because, again, I think Danielle Smith's going to feel she has a mandate. She won more than half the vote. She's got a majority in her legislature. Most of her MLAs are going to be from those rural parts of Alberta that probably support that agenda even more deeply than those in some of the bigger cities. And so you're going to see, I think, friction. And that might play to Justin Trudeau's advantage in a way too, in that you have conflict creates choice, creates a difference. But I also think that Danielle Smith may not find a lot of allies, despite how many Conservative premiers there are. If she's going to raise wanting to take Alberta out of the CPP, or those are things that not a lot of other provinces are going to feel, I think, comfortable about, because it's going to perhaps jeopardize or risk the entire system in a way. And Doug Ford, for example, in Ontario, hasn't been very combative with Justin Trudeau. In fact, I think Ontario Liberals would say they've been a little too close. So I think it's going to create some interesting opportunities for both sides federally, but I don't think it necessarily changes anyone's strategy. I think Alberta went as most thought it would, and despite Danielle Smith's unpopularity for some or controversial nature, she still pulled off a pretty impressive win and proved her critics wrong.
Yeah, and I think that's certainly it'll be interesting, as you said, which way the dynamic plays. I mean, does all of this noise actually help a Justin Trudeau campaign? By the way, he said, I'm staying. I'm going to be into this next campaign. Or, does it give the Conservative leader and the party federally more license to be a little bit more outrageous? I wonder, again, there seems to be a mood for that, certainly in certain regions of the country. But when you look at the map in Alberta right now, and you talk about that split, that blue versus orange. I mean, orange was all urban. Yep. And, we talk a lot about, generally speaking, that urban, suburban, urban, rural split in terms of how we govern. And I can see that certainly Alberta is unique in that respect in terms of how it would approach that. But it's almost the opposite here in Ontario, where the vast majority of the population lives in the urban center. I mean, we talk about 905-416. That's a significant part. So, our definition of conservatism regionally is really starting to take on more unique characteristics, no?
It is. Again, a conservative in Atlantic Canada looks very different from a conservative now in Alberta. And you had conservatives in Alberta saying this conservative party is not really conservative, and this conservative premier is not really conservative. But your point's really important, I think, and right, that Alberta, the dynamics in Alberta and the distribution of the population doesn't reflect the national story, right? You can't win a federal election. You can't win a majority government on rural and small communities alone. You can in Alberta, right? You can basically build the base and then win a number of the seats in sort of the surrounding regions of the bigger cities. You can't without winning substantial seats in the GTA, the Lower Mainland, Montreal, and you're right. The conservative story right now may not be appealing that much to those regions, right? We just finished a survey. We haven't released it, but nationally we have the federal conservatives at 35 and the liberals at 30. But if you look below the numbers, the conservatives aren't making much progress in the GTA, in the Lower Mainland. The liberals are still very competitive there, and that might be the lesson. But as I said, I don't know if Mr. Poilievre and the people around him believe they have to change, right? Mm-hmm. There's those that think they are going to face a ceiling if they continue to, play to their base and not to the center of the political spectrum. But Alberta may be, they may take a cue from Alberta to say, maybe we don't have to. I don't know. Mm-hmm. Just because you should do something doesn't mean you will because you believe it. And I do think that, Mr. Poilievre has a certain set of beliefs and he's not going to necessarily step away from them, even if it means winning is going to be a little bit harder.
Before we go, I want to get your take on picking up on a conversation we had maybe a month ago when, they started to talk seriously about who was going to be the mayor of the city of Toronto. And you and I were talking specifically about the value of any horse race polling and how difficult it would be to just keep up with it and present it in a way that reflected voter intention as opposed to name recognition. I'm not sure that we're past that. I had a rather spirited conversation with John Wright on Friday during our politics podcast, Ontario Politics podcast. And it was his view that, to really make sense of anything in this case, you would need almost a consortium of media and maybe even a consortium of researchers to look at this to say this is almost the standard by which we're going to present these numbers. and what they mean, and and so on.
Yeah.
To the point where, and the reason John brought it up is it worries him that robocalling polling done overnight, and I don't want to get into having to comment necessarily on the methodology or other pollsters. I don't want to put you there, but to say that their results were actually driving who gets in front of the public in all of these debates, quite frankly, and that isn't necessarily the best way, or even a useful or a healthy way for us to be exercising our franchise, never mind just generally democracy.
Yeah. So let me first disclose one thing, and that is I'm not actively working on a campaign, but I have done polling for one of the candidates, which is why Abacus hasn't done any publicly released numbers. And if you think about the number of candidates and the few polls that have actually been released, there's only been basically 2 or 3 companies releasing polls. I think that's part of the reason is a lot of us are actually engaged in some way in this election, and I think it's unethical to at once release public numbers when I'm helping at least provide input to a campaign. But your point is really important, right? And this is I understand the responsibility that I have and the bias that I bring to my work. I listened to that episode, and John's right. A pollster will decide whether to include a candidate's name or not, and just simply that choice means I am making and if those polls are being used to determine who gets to stand on a debate stage, then that's my choice as a pollster. And I can put Anthony Furey or not on my list of candidates. I can put Anthony Perusa, who's a city councillor, by all accounts, has enough experience maybe to be mayor, but he's not showing up on any of the polls because nobody's asking whether people are going to vote for him. So I do think there's something there. On the other hand, how do you decide out of 102 candidates who gets invited? And you can't, I don't want to watch a debate with 20 candidates on that stage because it's not really going to be a debate. It's going to be, may as well just have them tweet something, and that's as much as they're going to be able to say, right? In the short period of time that they have. But I do think, I've been watching this Toronto mayoral election is absolutely fascinating for a number of reasons. One is, it should be an important decision that voters are making, but it does feel like very few are actually following it. And so when you're looking at the polls to measure where the race is, it is almost entirely name recognition. And it may end being a race about who's known versus who people actually think, once they've gotten to know them, who would make the best mayor. And so, and that's just the nature of this election. So we'll see. I still think there's a chance that in the final 2 weeks of the campaign, even though it's going to be June, and if weather's like it is this week, why would people be paying attention? That you might actually start to see some real movement in the numbers as people actually start to say, okay, I have to make a choice now. Let me compare these candidates. Because right now, I think they are simply saying, oh, Olivia Chow, I know her, I have a favorable view of her, and I don't know any of the other candidates running, so I'm going to likely vote for her, right? I do think Olivia Chow's the front runner, but I don't think people have actually given much thought to, if you don't want Olivia Chow, who might a better alternative be? So it's a very hard election, I think, to poll for that reason, because so few people are actually paying attention.
So to what extent is the opportunity here to be able to say this is our chance to reshape, reform the election process, maybe not municipally across the province, but certainly in Toronto? And I think, you and I may have touched on this the last time, but, to be an eligible candidate, you just have to have a pulse almost and a couple $100 in your pocket. To sort of set that criteria is at a higher bar, I think is one thing. And then, the ranked ballot question always comes up. Or, the possibility of runoffs. I mean, we need a mayor. If you're going to have somebody with strong mayor powers, surely you need a mayor that has a strong mandate. And I think people are throwing around numbers. Well, you even look at the polls, if somebody's going to win and be the mayor with less than 30% of the vote, what kind of legitimacy is there in that mandate? So to me, and I realize this is a big, weedy issue, not necessarily something that most politicians would want to get into, but Premier Ford has not backed away from, reimagining and reconfiguring how we conduct municipal politics in this province, from Toronto to Peel and et cetera. I'm wondering whether or not there isn't a real opportunity here to do it right.
Look, I'm putting my political scientist hat on and taking my pollster hat off, but I think there is a problem. I think the system's not working well to serve the interests of not just Toronto, but a lot of large municipalities across the province. You don't have political parties, and the impact of that is voters, therefore, name recognition becomes almost everything, right? And so you have incumbent councillors and often mayors easily winning, because to build up the name recognition, you need to compete with somebody who's been mayor or has been close, has a profile citywide, means you've got to raise millions of dollars and have lots of time to build that kind of name recognition. Whereas if you run for a political party, you already start with a base of support, because if you're inclined to vote Liberal, you're going to start perhaps there. You might not end there, but you're going to start there, right? So it's very different in a non-party environment. And then I think I get the idealism of allowing more or less anybody to run for political office. I don't think we need to limit who can and who can't. But I do think the fact that there are 102 candidates actually makes this race far less serious, and the job far less serious than it is. And I think we have to find a way to put some kind of other qualifiers that allows you to get to a next stage, to be actually on the ballot, right? You can register to run, but what do we do? I don't know the answer. And then finally, I'm 100% in support of ranked ballot on 102 candidates would be really difficult. So
Yeah.
A runoff of some kind. I mean, we're talking about Alberta. Alberta, at least historically, the Alberta Conservative Party had done that, where they, and a lot of political parties use ranked ballots. The Ontario Liberals are going to elect their next leader with a ranked ballot. So it's happening in all these parties. They're just not willing to do it in jurisdictions. And I think, imagine if you had, Olivia Chow and Mark Saunders, or Olivia Chow and Brad Bradford, or Olivia Chow and Anna Bayo in a head-to-head for 2 weeks after that first vote, like just happened in Turkey. Mm-hmm. You'd have a real choice then for voters to make, and you're right, a mandate for whoever wins that kind of election. So I hope we see some creativity from Queen's Park in how they design and structure elections going forward. I'll be the skeptic though until that happens.
David Coletto, thanks for joining us. It's always good to have your insight, and I would encourage you, if you're listening to this, to pick up David's podcast, because the cello playing just by itself is worth
soothing.
It is. It's just awesome. Thanks, David.
Thanks, Dave.
All right, that'll do it for us here for Now and Next. It's the 30th day of May, and again, if you want to get involved in our How to Grow Your Show, your podcast, you can do that. We're all at it tomorrow on the ultimate day of May 2023. I'm Dave Trafford. It's Now and Next for Story Studio Network.
Pay no attention to that man behind the curtain.
Now and Next is produced by Becky Coles. Our production manager is Jamie Nickerson. Audio editors are Mike Trutler and Drew Garner. And our sonic logo designer is Greg McDonald. Our executive producers are Dave and Aaron Trafford.
This is SSN.
Story Studio Network.